Hello, and thank you for joining me. This is the weekly worm update on my 5 vermicomposting bins. I'm starting with one of my regular totes, and the castings in the regular totes are definitely benefiting from the cooler weather that I'm experiencing here in southern New Jersey. The castings in this bin feel really good. They're not too soggy, they're not too dry. The worms are actually distributed kind of throughout, even though I do have a nice size worm ball that I'm just about to get to. But otherwise, this bin is looking really, really good in comparison to how it was going for me over the summer. Now, in this bin, a lot of the cardboard, see, there's that nice size worm ball I was talking about. There's a whole bunch of these guys right there, and they're enjoying whatever was left over, munching on that. But in this bin, I do have a lot of breakdown of the cardboard in here, which is great. They are working through the cardboard. And as they're doing so, what I need to do is make sure that I don't put too much material in this bin. Since these bins, the regular totes, do benefit from the horizontal migration, I want to make sure when I push all the material to one side, it doesn't come up too far on the bin and that I can still do a good migration. So this is me just testing it, and I think I can add just a little bit more material before I'd have to just call it quits. Again, I really don't want to harvest light bins for castings. I want to have enough castings for when my season starts in the spring. I typically have no castings for the spring and a bunch in the fall, so I want to try to balance that out. After testing out how much material is currently in the bin, on this bin, I'm going to give it a more normal size feeding because the castings are at a good consistency. So I don't feel uncomfortable giving it a normal size feeding for the bin. And as always, after feeding up the bin, I give it the grit, and I'm going to cover this up with the bubble wrap and the mosquito screen, and this will be set up for the next week. Moving over to the second regular tote. Now this tote I did add quite a bit of cardboard to in the previous week because it had a lot of moisture content. This bin, even though it's in the same spot as the other regular tote, it tended to hold a lot of moisture over the last cycle. So I was hoping that adding the cardboard would have allowed for the cardboard to soak up some of that water in the casting, but it seems like the castings overall are more wet than they were last week. They definitely don't feel like what the other bin feels like, which is always a challenge when you're doing the same thing basically to your bins and they don't react the same way. And I haven't figured out why that is. It could be colony size, but it's just interesting how they are in the same environment, but they are different. And I'm doing the same thing with this bin, just checking the level of the castings to make sure that I don't have too much material in here when it comes to the harvest. I think for this one is definitely going to end up being the one of the last few times I give it some cardboard because it does have more material in it, it seems like, than the other bin. But in this bin, I did not have any worm balls. The worms themselves were distributed all throughout, and I find that they seem to not be in worm balls when there is a lot of bedding material still available to them. So the same thing is going to happen for this bin. I'm going to give them a good size feeding, a little bit larger than the other bin because I think my colony in this bin might be a bit larger than the other one. After the feeding, of course, it gets the grit, and I will be covering this up, putting the bubble wrap and the mosquito screen on, and this bin will also be set up for another week. Moving over to the first of my Vermi bag totes. Now this tote is the tote where I am working on increasing the colony. And from a tip from someone who subscribes to the channel, I am adding cardboard to one of the sides of this tote in an effort to encourage the worms. So I never had plans to keep this piece of cardboard in here. I just didn't have newspaper, so I was checking it to make sure the worms hadn't gotten in between the grooves before I dumped that out. I didn't see any worms in there, so I'm just peeling back some of the shredded cardboard here. I wasn't sure initially how I was going to attack this side of the bin with the cardboard up there, because I realized I really didn't want to remove everything and disturb the worms, but I hadn't really thought through what I wanted to do at the time that I was feeding up this bin. So I just took the cardboard off this week, the shredded cardboard off. And when I did, I noticed that the castings all over this bin were super wet. And that could be from me adding water to the cardboard that just ran into the castings themselves. But I seem to have created another problem for myself beyond the fact that there's a small colony in here. I have made the castings hold a lot more moisture than I want them to do. So I'm going to try this another way next week and try not to disturb the cardboard side, kind of do it like a horizontal migration, even though I'm not migrating them, and leave that side alone for a couple of weeks to encourage the worms to go in and have fun. But I'm going to give this bin, aside from the issue with the additional moisture content, this bin was fine. The worms looked happy, so I'm going to give it the smallest feeding of all my bins again, because there's not a large worm population. Put that cardboard back onto it, and since I have newspaper this week, I am only going to wet the newspaper. Definitely don't need any additional moisture in the rest of the bin, and I do want to add some moisture somewhere so that the cardboard doesn't dry out. This is all an experiment for me. I'm really not trying to harm the worms in any way, but I just want to try to see how I can increase the numbers, as I've said before, without snatching worms from other bins or buying any more. So this week, both of the Vermi bag totes seem to have been holding on to moisture. As I moved into the second Vermi bag tote, it as well had a lot more water in the castings than have been in previous weeks. Despite that, the worms still are doing good. I know I've said it and it might be repeating myself over and over, but the worms enjoy the castings a little bit wetter. But for me, I can't have the really wet castings because they get into muddy very fast, and there is nothing worse than trying to harvest a really muddy and wet bin. So it could be attributed to just adding the cardboard to the material. Here's a nice grouping of worms just hanging out in the cardboard section with the food. It could be attributed to having added the cardboard to the bin that's causing it to hold the water. But I do find it interesting that for the first time in quite a few weeks, that the Vermi bag totes are the ones that I have to watch out for the water content in them versus being the regular totes. I'm starting to question whether or not these should be my favorite system. But after going through the castings and just making sure everything was okay, I'm still going to give this a normal size feeding. Still running through all the watermelon from the summer. It seems like that's what I have the most of right now to feed them. So not only am I adding food that has a high moisture content, I've got bins that already have a lot of moisture in them. So I might be adding to the problem just by feeding the bin itself. But as long as I keep it under control, that's the best thing. A large part of vermicomposting and keeping worms is just reacting to what is going on in your bin after the week before and trying to remember what you did that may have caused a particular situation to happen. But the feeding goes as normal for this bin. I'm adding the bubble wrap and this gets closed up, and that concludes the update for the second Vermi tote. for my Vermibag Mini. When I opened the Vermibag Mini this week, I was absolutely horrified. You can't see them, they're too small to pick up on camera, but what I'm doing is taking duct tape and picking up all the beetles. So those little black dots that you see on the tape, those are the beetles that have come up out of the bin. And even though I skipped a feeding last week on the Vermibag Mini, it seems like that still didn't do much for the beetle population. So I just took the duct tape to the lid of the bin and to the sides of the bin and got rid of them. I know there are traps that you can make with duct tape for the bins that don't really affect the worms, but do get the beetles. I couldn't figure out where I had saw that before, and if next week my bin looks like that as well, I will definitely research. But I did get a lot of the beetles off of that. And once I got into the bin itself, the castings remarkably still had quite a bit of moisture in them, given that I did not feed the bin the previous week. So I'm just mixing in the more damp middle section with the sides, even though most of the castings were at a good moisture content, the edges were still crispy. Not that I've given up on trying to get the bubble wrap around it. I just haven't had a chance to sit down and do the strap idea that I was given from the subscriber who suggested putting the bubble wrap around the edges. So I haven't finished that, haven't started that experiment with the Vermibag tote yet. But I'm going to put some watermelon in here with the castings, and definitely cut back on the amount of food that I have been putting into this bin. It was fun to test the moisture content, but the explosion of beetles in the bin definitely was not my intention. So I'm going to pull back on the food, cover this up with some of the castings, put the bubble wrap on, and then the Vermibag Mini will be updated for another week. And that concludes the update for all of the bins this week. I do appreciate you sticking to the end of this video. If you enjoy the content, please like and subscribe. And as always, thank you so much for watching.